May 23, 1945, Camp Swift, Texas. The wooden crate arrived at dawn, carried by two privates who set it down outside the medical barracks without ceremony. No return address, no manifest number, just rough pine boards held together with rusted nails and a single line of faded text stenciled across the top medical equipment. Handle with care. Captain Nathaniel Mercer stood in the doorway of his office, coffee growing cold in his tin cup, watching dust motes dance in the early light. He was 42 years old, a country doctor who'd spent 3 years patching holes in boys who should have been playing baseball instead of storming beaches. He had steady hands, a face lined from Oklahoma sun and military worry, and eyes that had seen too many things he'd never be able to forget. The crate didn't belong to him. He hadn't requisitioned any equipment. The supply manifest showed nothing incoming from Austin, nothing from San Antonio, nothing from anywhere that made sense. He set down his coffee and walked across the compound. The Texas heat was already building, turning the air thick and heavy. Grasshoppers clicked in the scrub brush beyond the fence line. Somewhere a radio played big band music, cheerful and distant. Mercer knelt beside the crate and worked the nails loose with a pry bar. The wood groaned. Splinters caught the morning light. When the lid came free, he stopped moving. Inside, packed in straw and burlap, sat a medical scale. Not the modern spring-loaded kind used in every army hospital across Europe and the Pacific. This was old. Cast iron and brass, the type that belonged in a doctor's office from before the Great War. The kind his father might have used. Mercer lifted it carefully. Heavy. 30 pounds at least. The brass weights were still in their wooden box, each one wrapped in cloth gone yellow with age. The platform showed scratches, dents, and something else. Dark stains. Rust, maybe. Or blood that had oxidized over years. A piece of paper lay beneath the scale, folded once. The handwriting was precise, almost architectural. Just one sentence. For the ones who need proof. No signature, no explanation. Mercer read it 3 times. He looked at the scale again, at those dark stains on the platform, at the weights that hadn't been calibrated in probably 20 years. He thought about throwing the whole thing away, reporting it to supply, filing it as a clerical error, and getting back to the 500 other things that demanded his attention on a Thursday morning in Central Texas. Instead, he carried the scale inside and set it on his desk. Before we continue, if you're finding value in these untold stories of World War II, please hit that like button and subscribe to keep this channel going. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Whether it's Berlin or Boston, Texas or Tokyo, we're honored to bring history to life for viewers around the world. Your support helps us uncover the stories that textbooks forgot, the moments that define what it means to be human when everything else has failed. Nathaniel Mercer hadn't planned on becoming a doctor. He'd planned on farming like his father, like his grandfather, like every Mercer man since 1867, when the family claimed 40 acres of Oklahoma red dirt and called it home. But in 1927, when Nathaniel was 14 years old, his father Thomas collapsed in the barn during harvest. Appendicitis. A simple thing, a routine surgery in any city hospital. But they were 40 miles from the nearest doctor, 60 from anything resembling a hospital, and by the time they got Thomas loaded in the wagon and moving, the appendix had ruptured. Nathaniel held his father's hand while they drove, felt it go from warm to cool to cold, watched his father's face turn grey, watched his breathing go shallow and laboured, watched life slip away mile by mile on a dirt road under a September sky so blue it hurt to look at. They were still 15 miles from the hospital when Thomas died. Nathaniel made a decision that day. He would never feel that powerless again. He would learn to fix what broke in human bodies. He would become the man who arrived in time, who had the knowledge and the tools and the steady hands to stop death from winning. He worked his way through medical school, washing dishes, cleaning laboratories, doing whatever paid enough to keep him fed and enrolled. Graduated 1933. Opened a practice in a town so small it barely appeared on maps. Treated farmers and ranchers and their families. Set bones, delivered babies, fought pneumonia and influenza, and all the small disasters of rural life. Then came the Dust Bowl, 1934 through 1937. The sky turned black with topsoil. Crops died. Cattle starved. Families packed what they could carry and headed west toward California, toward anywhere that might offer work and food and a future that didn't taste like dirt. Mercer stayed. He treated malnutrition in children whose bellies swelled with kwashiorkor. He watched bodies consume themselves when food ran out. He learned to recognize starvation in its early stages, its middle stages, its final stages. He learned what weight loss looked like on different frames, how skin changed texture, how eyes went hollow, how the body prioritized organs shutting down the periphery to protect the core until even that failed. He learned that weight didn't lie. You could fake feeling better. You could smile and say you were fine. But the scale told the truth. Always. When Pearl Harbor burned, Mercer was 38. Too old for the draft essential to his community, exempt from service by any reasonable standard. He volunteered anyway. Took a commission as a captain in the Army Medical Corps. Spent 3 years in field hospitals from North Africa to France treating shrapnel wounds and burns and amputations. Saw boys die on tables despite his best efforts. Saved others who shouldn't have survived but did anyway, stubborn and tough as the country that made them. He developed a reputation. Steady hands, good judgment. Didn't panic when things went wrong, which they often did in field hospitals where supplies ran short and casualties ran high. The kind of doctor soldiers wanted when they were bleeding out. The kind officers trusted to make hard decisions about who got morphine and who got bandages and who got nothing, because nothing would help. In May of 1945, the war in Europe ended. The shooting stopped. The bombs stopped falling. Church bells rang across America. But Mercer knew the real work was just beginning. The work of putting broken pieces back together. The work of healing what 4 years of industrial violence had torn apart. They transferred him to Camp Swift, 60 miles east of Austin. A prisoner of war facility. Germans mostly captured during the final Allied push through France and into the Reich itself. Soldiers who'd surrendered when it became clear the war was lost. Workers who'd been caught in the wrong uniform at the wrong time. Women who'd served in auxiliary roles making bandages and uniforms for the Wehrmacht in factories that ran 24 hours a day until the Americans arrived. Mercer's job was simple. Keep them healthy. Treat acute injuries. Prevent disease outbreaks. Make sure they didn't die while in American custody. Basic medical care as defined by the Geneva Convention and military regulations. Adequate, not exceptional, just adequate. The transport arrived on May 23rd. 40 women from a labor camp near Bremen, ages 18 to 35. Classified as auxiliary workers, which meant they weren't technically soldiers, but had still been part of the German war machine. They'd been loaded onto trucks in northern Germany, transferred to trains shipped across the Atlantic in cargo holds, then loaded onto more trucks for the final leg to central Texas. The journey took 3 weeks. Lieutenant Dorothy Callahan met Mercer outside the medical barracks at 1300 hours. She was 30 years old from Boston, a nurse who'd worked trauma wards before the war and brought that same efficient intensity to military medicine. Dark hair pulled back severe, eyes that missed nothing, a clipboard thick with intake forms. "They're in bad shape, sir," she said without preamble. "Worse than anything we've processed before." Mercer nodded. "How bad?" "I've documented initial assessments. You should see for yourself." They walked across the compound. The sun hammered down. Heat shimmered off the packed earth. Somewhere a guard was singing along to a radio voice, cheerful and oblivious. The sound felt wrong, discordant. Callahan pushed open the barracks door. "They're ready for you, sir." Mercer stepped inside and stopped breathing. 40 women stood in rows, not at attention exactly. More like they were arranged by some invisible hand, organized by height perhaps, or by whatever system the transport officers had used. They wore grey dresses, issued by the camp identical and shapeless. Their heads were mostly down eyes on the floor, but a few looked up when Mercer entered. What struck him first wasn't the obvious malnutrition, though that was horrifying enough. It wasn't the hollow eyes or the sharp angles of bones pressing against skin. It was the silence. Complete. Absolute. 40 women breathing in perfect quiet. No talking, no movement. Just stillness so profound it felt like the building itself was holding its breath. The air inside was cooler than outside, but it carried something Mercer couldn't name. Not fear exactly. Something older. Something that settled in his chest like cold water. He set down his medical bag. The sound echoed too loud in that silence. Callahan stood near the entrance, her clipboard held like a shield. Her usual professional composure had been replaced by something else. Carefully controlled rage. Mercer recognized it immediately. The anger that came from seeing suffering that should never have happened. The kind that burned cold and steady. She handed him a preliminary report without speaking. The handwriting was precise, clinical, but Mercer could read the emotion bleeding through every line. Severe malnutrition in 37 cases. Advanced tuberculosis in 12. Untreated fractures in 8. Infections that should have been treated weeks earlier now spreading through tissue and bone. And then, at the bottom of the page, one line that changed everything. 3 patients pregnant. High risk. Immediate intervention required. Mercer read it twice. He looked up at the rows of silent women. He thought about the scale on his desk, that cryptic note. For the ones who need proof. "Let's start the examinations," he said quietly. The first woman stepped forward when Callahan gestured. She was perhaps 24 years old, though malnutrition made ages hard to judge. Blonde hair cut short and uneven, like someone had taken shears to it without care or skill. Hands clasped in front of her knuckles, white with tension. Mercer pulled the old scale from where Callahan had set it up near his examination area. The brass weights clicked softly as he calibrated 0. The mechanism was smooth despite its age, probably more accurate than the newer spring models. He spoke in careful German, the language his grandmother had taught him in an Oklahoma farmhouse that smelled of bread and wood smoke. "My name is Captain Mercer. I'm a doctor. I need to examine you to make sure you're healthy. Can you step on the scale, please?" The woman nodded. Her eyes were blue, ringed with shadows so dark they looked like bruises painted on porcelain. She stepped onto the platform. The weights settled. Mercer slid the brass markers, adjusting, calibrating, reading the numbers that couldn't lie. 68 pounds. He checked again, moved the weights back and forth, looked at the woman standing there, 5 feet 4 inches tall, 24 years old according to her intake papers. 68 pounds. A 12-year-old child should weigh more. A healthy adult woman of that height should weigh between 110 and 130. This woman weighed less than half that. Mercer's hands went still on the scale. He looked at her face, at the sharp angles of her cheekbones, at collarbones so prominent they cast shadows. He could count ribs through the grey dress, could see the tendons in her neck like cables under too thin skin. "What's your name?" he asked in German. "Elizabeth Schneider." "What did you do before the war, Elizabeth?" "Seamstress, in Hamburg." Mercer listened to her heartbeat. Too fast. Fluttering like a trapped bird. He listened to her breathing, shallow and laboured, with a wet rattle deep in her chest that suggested fluid build-up. Tuberculosis, almost certainly. Advanced stage. Without treatment, she had perhaps 3 months. He examined her hands. Fingernails split and blackened from chemicals. Burns on her palms from hot metal or steam. Calluses that told stories of 16-hour days making bandages and uniforms in factories where conditions were measured in output, not human welfare. "Are you pregnant, Elizabeth?" She looked at him directly for the first time. Those blue eyes held something Mercer would remember for the rest of his life. Not fear, not hope. Just a kind of resigned acceptance that made his throat tighten. "Yes," she said quietly. Mercer completed the examination. He noted everything in his chart: the racing heartbeat, the laboured breathing, the signs of tuberculosis that had gone untreated for months, the pregnancy that was putting impossible strain on a body that had nothing left to give. Elizabeth stepped off the scale and returned to her place in the silent rows. The next woman came forward. Anna Weber, 22 years old, 71 pounds, tuberculosis, malnutrition so severe her body was consuming muscle tissue to survive. Then Maria Hoffman, 21, 66 pounds, pregnant, signs of placental insufficiency that meant the baby wasn't getting enough blood flow, wasn't growing right, might not survive to term, even if Maria did. By noon, Mercer had examined 15 women. The pattern was consistent and damning. This wasn't just missed meals. This wasn't the normal hardship of war rationing. This was systematic deprivation. Bodies cannibalizing themselves, bones setting at wrong angles because there was no one to set them properly. Infections spreading because there was no medicine, no care, no intervention. Several had injuries that had healed incorrectly. Broken bones that had knitted together, crooked, creating permanent deformities. One woman had a compound fracture in her left arm that had somehow mended without surgical intervention, leaving her with limited mobility and constant pain. She was 23 years old. Mercer stopped at the 20th examination. He walked outside. The Texas sun blazed overhead, turning the ground into a shimmer of heat and dust. Grasshoppers rattled in the scrub. A guard walked past, whistling something cheerful, oblivious. Mercer stood there for several minutes, breathing deep, trying to steady himself against a rage so pure it made his hands shake. Callahan followed him out, carrying 2 cups of coffee despite the temperature. She handed him one without speaking. "They're dying," Mercer said finally. His voice came out rough, barely controlled. "Half of them have tuberculosis. The others are so malnourished they're at risk of organ failure." He stopped, started again. "And those 3 pregnant women. Without immediate intervention, we lose the mothers, the babies, or both." Callahan nodded. "I've already sent word to headquarters. They're bringing in additional medical supplies and staff." Mercer shook his head. "Supplies won't be enough. These women need intensive care. They need proper nutrition rest medication we don't have on hand. Some need surgery." He paused, looking back at the barracks. "Those pregnancies are high risk. Elizabeth is 68 pounds and carrying a child. The human body can't do that. Physics doesn't work that way." The regulations were clear. Prisoners of war received adequate medical care as defined by military standards. Adequate meant treating acute injuries, preventing infectious disease outbreaks, maintaining basic health. It did not mean intensive intervention. It did not mean prioritizing prisoner care over military personnel. It certainly did not mean dedicating limited resources to saving the lives of women who had worked for the regime, who had made the bandages that wrapped American wounds, who had sewn the uniforms worn by soldiers who'd killed American boys on beaches from Normandy to the Pacific. But Mercer had not become a doctor to follow regulations. He had become a doctor because his father died in a wagon while help was too far away, because he'd sworn never to feel that powerless again. He walked back to his office, sat at his desk, pulled out the proper forms and began typing. An emergency medical request. Detailed, clinical, emphasizing severity, outlining the potential for multiple fatalities without immediate action. He requested permission to transfer the most critical patients to the base hospital, to allocate additional nursing staff to the barracks, to obtain specialized medications and equipment. Streptomycin for the tuberculosis, vitamins for the malnutrition, prenatal care for the pregnancies. He typed it himself. Double-spaced each line, checked every fact twice, signed at the bottom, sealed it in an envelope and sent it through channels to Colonel Warren Hartfield, the base commander. The response came back within 2 hours. Request denied. Resources were limited. The war might have ended in Europe, but fighting continued in the Pacific. Medical supplies were earmarked for combat troops preparing for the invasion of Japan, not prisoners. The base hospital had wounded American soldiers requiring care. Boys who'd fought at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Boys who'd earned their treatment with blood and sacrifice. Captain Mercer was authorized to provide basic treatment within the barracks, using available supplies. Nothing more. Mercer read the response 3 times. His jaw tightened with each pass. He thought about his father dying in that wagon, about the helplessness of watching someone slip away when help existed but was just too far to reach. He thought about Elizabeth Schneider, 68 pounds and pregnant, asking in that quiet voice if she was dying. He folded the paper, placed it in his desk drawer, stood up. He had spent 4 years in the army, 4 years learning which rules were suggestions and which were laws, learning that military bureaucracy moved slowly, that supply chains had gaps, that paperwork could be creatively interpreted, learning that sometimes the only way to save lives was to stop asking permission. Callahan was treating one of the pregnant women when Mercer returned to the barracks. The woman lay on a cot, her swollen belly visible beneath a thin blanket, her breathing shallow and rapid. Callahan had started an intravenous line pumping precious fluids into veins that looked ready to collapse. "How is she?" Mercer asked. "Katerina Braun, 26 years old, pelvic infection spreading." Callahan kept her voice level, professional. "She needs surgery, or we lose both her and the baby, probably within 48 hours. Mercer moved to Katerina's side. She had brown hair darker than the others and hands scarred from factory work. Her chart said she'd been a teacher before the war, recruited to work in textile production when the Reich demanded total mobilization. She had a husband somewhere, captured by Soviet forces during the retreat from Poland. No way of knowing if he was alive or dead. No way of reaching him even if he was. Katerina's eyes opened, grey clouded with pain and exhaustion. She looked at Mercer with an expression he would never forget. Not fear, not anger, just resigned acceptance, like she'd already made peace with dying. "Am I dying?" she asked in broken English. Mercer pulled up a stool, sat beside her cot, took her hand carefully, mindful of the IV line. Her skin was cold despite the Texas heat. "No," he said firmly. "You're not dying. Not while I'm breathing." He stood up, walked to the center of the barracks. 40 women in various stages of examination and treatment. 40 lives hanging by threads so thin they were almost invisible. He thought about his father, about that promise made in a wagon on a dirt road 38 years ago, about never being powerless again. He thought about the scale on his desk, those dark stains on the platform, that note, for the ones who need proof. Weight didn't lie. Elizabeth was 68 pounds. That was a fact. Numbers were truth. And the truth was that these women would die without intervention that army regulations wouldn't allow. So Mercer made a decision. That evening, he broke his first regulation. He sat in his office with a stack of requisition forms and began writing. Medical supplies marked for military personnel, antibiotics, vitamins, clean linens, proper bandages, streptomycin for tuberculosis treatment, newly developed, expensive, in short supply. He signed forms with creative descriptions, vague enough to pass through supply chain review, specific enough to get what he needed. When he referenced an outbreak of infectious disease that threatened the entire camp, he wasn't technically lying. Tuberculosis was infectious. It could spread. Better to treat it aggressively now than deal with an epidemic later. The logic was sound even if the intent was deceptive. He submitted the forms through proper channels, waited, paced his office, looked at that scale sitting on his desk, touched the brass weights, wondered who had sent it, wondered if they knew what he was about to do. The supply sergeant called at 2100 hours. Questions about the requisition. The quantities seemed high, the descriptions seemed vague. Was there something Captain Mercer needed to explain? Mercer mentioned the infectious disease concern, emphasized the potential for camp-wide outbreak, suggested that containing the situation now would be more cost-effective than dealing with mass casualties later. The forms were approved within an hour. The supplies arrived the next morning. Crates of antibiotics, bottles of vitamins, clean bandages still wrapped in sterile packaging, streptomycin in small glass vials precious as gold. Mercer signed for everything, carried it personally to the barracks, started treatment protocols that should have required authorization from medical command, oversight from senior physicians, approval from administrators who understood the political implications of dedicating this level of care to enemy prisoners. He did it anyway. By noon on May 24th, he'd broken his second regulation. He made phone calls to colleagues in Austin, doctors he'd trained with before the war, people who understood that medical ethics transcended nationality and politics. Dr. Beatrice Whitmore answered on the third ring. Obstetrician, 38 years old, smart-skilled, unafraid of complicated cases. "Nathaniel," she said, "it's been years. What do you need?" 3 high-risk pregnancies, severe malnutrition, 1 with spreading infection. They need specialist care and I can't provide it alone. Military or civilian? German prisoners of war. Silence on the line. Mercer could hear her breathing, thinking, calculating the implications. "When?" she asked. "Today, if possible. Tomorrow at latest." "I'll be there by 1600 hours. Don't ask me for authorization papers because I won't have them." Dr. Samuel Garrett Surgeon, 45 years old, said yes before Mercer finished explaining. "I'll bring my own instruments. See you tonight." They arrived quietly. Unmarked cars, personal equipment, no questions about authorization or payment. They walked into the barracks, assessed the patients, and started working. By sunset on May 24th, Mercer had transformed the prisoner barracks into a functioning field hospital. He organized it by condition. 1 section for tuberculosis patients isolated to prevent spread. Another for general malnutrition cases with carefully planned feeding schedules designed to prevent refeeding syndrome, where introducing food too quickly to a starved body could cause fatal electrolyte imbalances. A 3rd section for the 3 pregnant women monitored around the clock for signs of complications. He worked 18-hour days, moving between patients, adjusting medications, monitoring vital signs, making countless small decisions that collectively determined who would live and who would slip away despite everything. On May 26th, the base commander learned about Mercer's unauthorized activities. Colonel Warren Hartfield was 55 years old, career military. Weathered face from decades of service, eyes hard as flint from making decisions that sent men to die and living with those decisions afterward. His office was a converted warehouse that smelled of cigar smoke and old paper. He sat behind a desk stacked with reports, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Captain Mercer," Hartfield began. His voice carried that particular tone of authority that expected immediate compliance. "You've been operating outside your assigned parameters. You've diverted military supplies. You've brought in unauthorized personnel. You've exceeded your medical authority." He paused, let the words settle in the space between them. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Mercer stood at attention. His mind raced through possible responses. He could apologize, claim ignorance of regulations, promise to comply with orders going forward. He could protect his career, avoid court-martial, maintain the military discipline that held the entire structure together. Instead, he said, "Sir, with respect, those women are dying. I took an oath to preserve life. That oath doesn't come with footnotes about nationality or prisoner status." Hartfield leaned back in his chair. For a long moment he said nothing, just studied Mercer with an expression that might have been anger or might have been something else entirely. The silence stretched like wire pulled taut. "Do you know what this looks like, Captain?" Hartfield finally asked. "An American officer prioritizing enemy prisoners over his own soldiers, using military resources to save the lives of women who worked for the regime, women who made the bandages and uniforms our boys bled through. The press gets hold of this and you'll be crucified. So will I. So will everyone associated with this camp." Mercer kept his voice steady. "Sir, if the press learns we let 40 women die in our custody when we had the means to save them, I believe the outrage would be considerably worse." Hartfield's expression shifted. Something that might have been a smile flickered at the corner of his mouth, gone before Mercer could be certain it was there. "You're a real pain, Captain Mercer," Hartfield said. but you're not wrong. He pulled out a form and began writing. His pen scratched across paper loud in the quiet office. I'm issuing you authorization for continued medical intervention. You'll report directly to me on all activities. You'll maintain detailed records. Every supply requisition, every treatment decision, every outcome. He looked up. And if this blows up in our faces, I'm throwing you under the bus so fast it'll make your head spin. Understood? Mercer felt tension he hadn't realized he was carrying drain from his shoulders. Understood, sir. Now get out of here and save some lives. Mercer walked back to the barracks as the sun set over central Texas. The sky turned orange and red color, bleeding across the horizon like paint. Grasshoppers sang in the scrub. Somewhere a radio played news about the Pacific War, about preparations for invasion, about casualties that kept mounting even though Europe had gone quiet. Inside the barracks, Elizabeth Schneider sat on her cot, eating small bites of food Callahan had prepared. 68 pounds. Pregnant. Tuberculosis. But eating now, taking medicine, under care that might actually save her life. She looked up when Mercer entered, those blue eyes still hollow, but maybe possibly carrying something that looked like hope. "Doctor," she said in careful English, "they said you fight for us. With the Colonel. Risk your career." Mercer pulled up a stool. "I'm a doctor, Elizabeth. Fighting for patients is what I do. But we are enemy. We worked for Reich, made bandages for soldiers who killed Americans. You're not my enemy. You're my patient. There's a difference." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "In Bremen they told us Americans are monsters, bayonet prisoners, spit on wounded, no mercy, no honor." She gestured around the barracks. "Here you give medicine, give food, risk career to save us. Everything they told us was lie." Mercer thought about propaganda, about how easy it was to make people believe terrible things about those they'd never met, about how war required dehumanization to function. "Not everything was a lie," he said quietly. "There are Americans who would let you die without blinking, just like there are Germans who showed mercy when they didn't have to. War makes monsters of some people and heroes of others. Mostly it just makes everyone tired and sad." Elizabeth nodded, took another small bite of food. Her hands shook, but she managed. "What happens now?" she asked. Mercer stood, looked around the barracks. 40 women in various stages of recovery. 3 pregnant, 12 with tuberculosis, all of them watching him with expressions that ranged from hope to suspicion to careful neutrality. "Now we prove that weight can come back," he said, "that bodies heal when given the chance, that numbers don't lie, but they can change." He walked to his office, sat at his desk, looked at the scale sitting there, brass weights gleaming in lamplight. For the ones who need proof. He pulled out his logbook and began recording weights. Elizabeth Schneider, 68 pounds. Anna Weber, 71. Maria Hoffman, 66. Every number exact. Every measurement truth. Tomorrow he would measure again. And the day after. And the day after that. Building a record of transformation that couldn't be denied or dismissed. Because weight didn't lie. And if he could make these numbers climb, if he could add pounds to frames that had been stripped to bone, then maybe he could prove something that mattered. That compassion was stronger than propaganda. That healing was possible even after industrial-scale cruelty. That one doctor with steady hands and broken regulations could stand between 40 lives and death, and sometimes, if he was lucky and stubborn enough, death would blink first. Outside, the Texas night settled over Camp Swift. Stars emerged in a sky so big and black it seemed to swallow everything. Somewhere a guard called out shift change. Somewhere a radio played music. Somewhere 40 women breathed in and out, hearts beating, blood-flowing bodies beginning the slow work of repair. And on a desk in a converted barracks, a scale waited to measure what happened next. May 27th, 1945. 3 days after Colonel Hartfield granted authorization, Nathaniel Mercer stood in the barracks at 0600 hours, watching dawn light filter through mesh-covered windows. The air smelled of disinfectant and illness, of bodies fighting infections that had spread too far, of the particular sourness that came from advanced tuberculosis. He carried his logbook, opened it to the weight records. Elizabeth Schneider, 68 pounds on May 23rd, 68.5 on May 24th, 68.3 on May 25th, 68.7 on May 26th. 4 days of treatment, 4 days of medications and fluids and careful feeding, 0.7 pounds gained, less than a pound total across 96 hours. The math was brutal. Elizabeth needed to reach 95 pounds minimum to have any chance of carrying her pregnancy to term. That meant gaining 27 pounds. At the current rate of 0.2 pounds per day, she'd need 135 days. The baby was due in 12 weeks, 84 days. The numbers didn't work. Mercer closed the logbook, looked at Elizabeth sleeping on her cot, one hand resting on her swollen belly. Even in sleep, her face showed strain. Dark circles under her eyes, skin stretched too tight over bones. The pregnancy making impossible demands on a body that had nothing left to give. Lieutenant Dorothy Callahan approached carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Mercer without speaking. They'd developed this routine. Early morning check-ins before the day's chaos began. Moment of quiet before stepping back into the impossible work of keeping 40 women alive. "The tuberculosis patients are responding to streptomycin," Callahan said quietly. "Clara's fever broke last night. Anna's coughing has decreased. I think we're winning that fight. And the pregnant women—" Callahan's expression tightened. "Katerina's infection is contained but not resolved. Maria's placental flow is still compromised. And Elizabeth—" She paused. "She's not gaining weight fast enough. The baby's taking everything she consumes. Her body's cannibalizing muscle tissue to support the pregnancy." Mercer had seen this before, during the Dust Bowl. Pregnant women in families where food ran out. The body prioritizing the fetus, sacrificing the mother's health to give the child a chance. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't. Both died together. "She's refusing food," Callahan added. "Eats maybe half of what we give her. Says she's not hungry. But I think it's something else." "What do you mean?" "Guilt, sir. She told me yesterday that every bite she takes she thinks about her mother in Hamburg, starving in the ruins. She says eating while her family suffers feels like betrayal." Mercer understood. He'd seen survivors' guilt in wounded soldiers who lived while their friends died. The irrational but overwhelming sense that surviving was somehow wrong. That comfort was a crime when others still suffered. "I'll talk to her," he said. Major Theodore Prescott appeared in the barracks doorway at 0700. He was 48 years old, base surgeon, career military doctor, who believed regulations existed for reasons and violations deserved punishment. His face was set in an expression of barely controlled anger. "Captain Mercer," Prescott said, voice clipped and formal, "we need to discuss your supply requisitions." Mercer set down his coffee. "What about them?" The quartermaster flagged unusual activity, large quantities of streptomycin, vitamins in amounts that exceed standard POW medical protocols, bandages, linens, foodstuffs beyond basic ration allocations. Prescott stepped closer. "I reviewed the authorizations. The justifications are vague at best, fraudulent at worst. Colonel Hartfield approved my medical interventions. Hartfield isn't a physician. He doesn't understand the implications of dedicating this level of resources to enemy prisoners." "Do you know what streptomycin costs? What those supplies could do for American soldiers?" Callahan stepped forward. "Sir, with respect, these women were dying. Captain Mercer's interventions have saved lives." Prescott turned his attention to her. "Lieutenant, your loyalty to your commanding officer is noted, but medical ethics require appropriate allocation of scarce resources. We have wounded Americans who need treatment. We have limited supplies. Spending them on prisoners who worked for the enemy is not just questionable, it's unconscionable." Mercer kept his voice level. "Major, I'm documenting every intervention, every outcome. The medical necessity is clear in the records. Then you won't mind if I report this to the Inspector General's office. Let them determine if your actions constitute appropriate medical care or theft of military property. The two men stared at each other. The barracks had gone quiet. 40 women watching this confrontation, understanding enough English or reading body language to know this was a threat. "Do what you think is necessary, Major," Mercer said finally. "I'll continue doing what I know is necessary." Prescott left without another word. His footsteps echoed across the compound, sharp and angry. Callahan exhaled slowly. "That's going to be a problem." "Let it be a problem. We have patients to treat." But Mercer knew Prescott was right about one thing. Resources were limited. Every vial of streptomycin used here was one less for an American soldier. Every bandage, every vitamin, every ounce of medical attention represented a choice, a calculation about who deserved care and who didn't. The math was brutal in different ways than weight gain, just as unforgiving. At 1000 hours, Mercer walked to the camp mess hall, found the cook, a sergeant from Alabama named Williams, who'd worked in his family's restaurant before the war. Williams was stirring a pot of something that smelled like institutional soup, bland and uninspired. "Sergeant," Mercer said, "I need a favor." Williams looked up. "Sir, can you cook bacon fresh? Not the reconstituted stuff from ration packs. Real bacon." Williams frowned. "I got some in the cold storage. For officer mess, mostly. Why? I need 6 strips. Cooked proper. Hickory smoke if you can manage it. Crispy edges, but still tender in the middle. This for you, sir. For a patient who needs to remember why eating matters." Williams studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Give me 20 minutes." Mercer returned to the barracks. Elizabeth was awake, sitting on her cot, staring at nothing. Her breakfast tray sat untouched beside her. Toast, scrambled eggs, orange juice, standard fare, all going cold. "Elizabeth," Mercer said in German. "May I sit with you?" She nodded. Mercer pulled up a stool. "Lieutenant Callahan tells me you're not eating." "I eat some. I eat." "Not enough. You need nutrition for yourself and the baby." Elizabeth's hands moved to her belly, protective and automatic. "I know. But when I eat, I think of Mutter, of my family in Hamburg. The city is destroyed. They have no food, no electricity, no water that's safe to drink. And I'm here, and there's food everywhere, and eating feels wrong." Mercer was quiet for a moment. Outside, a truck rumbled past. Voices called out orders, normal military business, the machinery of occupation and containment. "When I was 12 years old," Mercer said slowly, "my father died. Appendicitis. We were too far from help. I watched him die in the back of a wagon while we tried to reach a doctor." Elizabeth looked at him. "For months after I couldn't eat. Every meal felt like celebrating while he was dead, like moving forward meant leaving him behind. My grandmother, she'd been cooking for our family for 40 years. She knew what grief looked like, what it did to people." "What did she do?" "She made bacon. Every morning for 2 weeks. Filled the house with the smell. Didn't force me to eat. Just cooked it and left it on the table. Said my father loved bacon. Said he'd want me to eat. To be strong. To live." "Did you eat?" "Eventually. Because she was right. Starving myself didn't honor his memory. Living did. Being strong enough to become the doctor who could save someone else's father that honored him." Elizabeth was quiet. Her hands still rested on her belly, feeling the baby move inside her. "Your mother," Mercer continued, "what would she want for you right now? To survive. To come home. Then eat. Not because you deserve comfort while she suffers, but because surviving is how you get back to her. Because that baby needs you strong. Because the only way to honor her sacrifice is to make sure it wasn't for nothing." Sergeant Williams appeared in the doorway carrying a plate. The smell hit immediately. Salt and smoke and rendered pork fat, hickory and caramelization and something primal that transcended language or nation. Bacon. Williams set the plate on Elizabeth's tray. 6 strips. Cooked exactly as Mercer had requested. Edges curled dark mahogany centers still glistening with fat that caught the morning light coming through the mesh windows. "Courtesy of the captain," Williams said. Then he left. Elizabeth stared at the bacon. Mercer watched her face, saw hunger war with guilt, saw her breathing change. Shallow, quick, the smell triggering responses her conscious mind wanted to deny. "In Oklahoma," Mercer said quietly, "my grandmother made bacon like this, fed me after my father died. Grief makes people refuse food, but living honors the dead better than starving." Elizabeth reached out. Her hand shook, fingers hovering over the plate. "Mutter eats tree bark in Hamburg," she whispered. "I eat bacon in Texas. This is wrong. Your mother would want you alive. This baby needs you alive. Eat one piece. For the child." Elizabeth lifted a strip of bacon. The fat had cooled slightly, congealing into white streaks against the darker meat. She brought it to her lips, hesitated, then bit down. The transformation was immediate. Her eyes closed. Her entire body went still. Salt hit first, sharp and clean. Then wood smoke, deep and complex, the hickory adding layers underneath the primary pork flavor. Then fat coating her tongue and throat like warm silk lubricating passages that had forgotten what satiation felt like. The crispy edges gave way to tender meat that melted without requiring chewing. Underneath the salt and smoke, subtle sweetness emerged. Pork sugar caramelized to amber during cooking, adding complexity most people never noticed, but that made all the difference. For 30 seconds, maybe 40, the war disappeared. The barracks disappeared. The guard towers and barbed wire and propaganda and fear all dissolved. There was only bacon, only salt and smoke and fat and the primal satisfaction of food that tasted like abundance. Then tears. Elizabeth opened her eyes and they were streaming. Her hand holding the bacon shook so hard Mercer thought she might drop it. "Mutter ate Baumrinder," she said, voice breaking. "Tree bark boiled in water. I eat 6 pieces of bacon. What kind of daughter does this? What kind of person?" Mercer leaned forward. "The kind who survives to see her mother again. The kind who gives this baby a chance at life. The kind who's strong enough to carry grief without letting it destroy her." Elizabeth looked at the remaining bacon. 5 strips still on the plate, still warm, still smelling like everything good she'd lost when the war came. She ate another piece, then another, slow at first, then faster, savoring each bite while simultaneously feeling the guilt that came with pleasure. By the 4th piece she was crying openly, tears running down her face while she chewed and swallowed and reached for more. When the plate was empty, she sat back. Her hands moved to her belly. The baby kicked, responding to the first substantial nutrition its mother had consumed in months. "Tomorrow," Mercer said gently, "we try scrambled eggs, real ones with butter. Then the day after, maybe pot roast, small amounts, building slowly, training your body to accept food again without shock." Elizabeth nodded. She couldn't speak, just sat there with tears on her face and the ghost of bacon taste in her mouth. Mercer picked up the scale. "Let's see if it made a difference." Elizabeth stood, stepped onto the platform. The weights settled. Mercer adjusted the brass markers, calibrating, reading the truth that numbers always told. 68.7 pounds, same as yesterday. The bacon hadn't magically added weight, but something had changed. Elizabeth had eaten. Not because someone forced her, not out of mechanical necessity, but because she'd remembered for 30 seconds what it felt like to experience pleasure, to taste something that made life worth living. The wall had broken. Over the next week, Mercer repeated the bacon scene with 15 other women, not all at once, carefully, individually. Each woman had different triggers, different foods that connected to memories of home, of family, of times before the war. For Anna Weber, it was chocolate. Real chocolate, not the waxy substitute. Sergeant Williams found some in the officer's supply. Anna held it in her mouth, letting it melt, and cried for her younger brother who'd loved chocolate, who'd been killed at Stalingrad at age 17. For Maria Hoffman, pot roast with carrots and potatoes. Comfort food. Sunday dinner food. She ate slowly, mechanically at first, then with increasing attention as her body remembered what satisfaction felt like. For Clara, the tuberculosis patient, it was apple pie, still warm, cinnamon and sugar and butter crust that flaked apart under her fork. She'd worked in a bakery before the war. The smell brought back muscle memory, hands shaping dough, flour on her apron, the satisfaction of creating something people enjoyed, each woman, each food, each moment of breaking through the wall that guilt and propaganda had built. The pattern was consistent. Smell triggered memory, memory triggered emotion, emotion broke through resistance. They'd eat, they'd cry, they'd feel guilty for experiencing pleasure while loved ones suffered, and Mercer would sit with them and explain that surviving wasn't betrayal. That strength honored sacrifice better than starvation. By June 1st, the weight records showed real change. Elizabeth Schneider, 74 pounds, 6-pound gain in 9 days. Anna Weber, 78 pounds, 7-pound gain. Maria Hoffman, 72 pounds, 6 pounds. The numbers were climbing, bodies responding to nutrition and medical care, tuberculosis patients clearing, infections resolving, bones beginning the slow work of healing fractures that had set wrong. But Katerina Braun wasn't improving. Dr. Beatrice Whitmore examined her on June 2nd. Whitmore had been coming to the camp every other day, driving from Austin in her personal vehicle, bringing her own equipment, asking no questions about authorization. She pulled Mercer aside after the examination. Her expression was grave. "The pelvic infection is spreading," she said quietly. "Despite antibiotics, despite everything we're doing, it's in the tissue now, moving toward the uterus. She needs surgery, or we lose both her and the baby." "How soon?" 48 hours, maybe less. Mercer found Colonel Hartfield in his office that afternoon, laid out the situation, the spreading infection, the need for surgical intervention, the operating room and equipment required. Hartfield listened, then picked up his phone and called the base hospital. Major Prescott answered. "I need an operating room prepared for emergency surgery," Hartfield said. "Tomorrow morning. 700 hours. Prescott's voice came through the phone line, tinny and hostile. "For which patient, sir?" "German POW, Katerina Braun. Pelvic infection requiring immediate intervention." Silence on the line. "Major," Hartfield prompted. "Sir, with respect, the operating rooms are reserved for American military personnel. We have scheduled surgeries tomorrow. Wounded soldiers from the Pacific Theater who've been waiting weeks for procedures. I cannot and will not displace American servicemen for an enemy prisoner." Hartfield's jaw tightened. "Major, this is a direct order." "Then I'm requesting you put that order in writing, sir, so there's no confusion about who authorized the use of military medical facilities for enemy combatants while American boys wait in pain." Mercer watched Hartfield's face, saw the calculation happening, the political implications, the potential for this to explode into something larger than one woman's life. Hartfield put down the phone without hanging up, looked at Mercer. "Can you do the surgery in the barracks?" "Not safely. We don't have proper equipment, proper sterilization. If something goes wrong during the procedure, we can't recover." "But it's possible." Mercer thought about his father dying in a wagon, about making decisions with incomplete resources, about the gap between ideal and possible. "It's possible," he said. "Dr. Whitmore and Dr. Garrett are skilled. We can improvise, but the risk to patient is significantly higher." Hartfield picked up the phone again. "Major Prescott, belay my last order. Captain Mercer will handle the situation using field medical protocols." He hung up, looked at Mercer. "Do what you can with what you have. I'll make sure you get whatever supplies you need. But we're not fighting this battle over operating room access. Not today." That night, Mercer Whitmore and Dr. Samuel Garrett converted the medical barracks into a surgical suite. They sterilized instruments in boiling water, hung sheets to create a sterile field, set up lighting using every lamp they could requisition, mixed anesthesia using army medical supplies and careful measurements. Katerina Braun lay on a table that had been scrubbed with disinfectant until the wood grain showed white. She was conscious, watching preparations with eyes that understood the stakes. "Will I die?" she asked Mercer in German. "Not if I can prevent it. And the baby. We're fighting for both of you." At 0400 hours on June 3rd, they began. Whitmore led. Her hands were steady despite the improvised conditions. Garrett assisted. Mercer managed anesthesia and vital signs. Callahan stood ready with instrument supplies, whatever was needed. The infection had spread further than imaging suggested. Whitmore worked carefully, cutting away dead tissue, cleaning the infection, repairing damage while preserving the pregnancy. The procedure took 3 hours. 3 hours of concentration so intense that time seemed to stop. 3 hours of making micro-decisions that collectively determined 2 lives. At 0700, Whitmore stepped back. "She's stable. The infection's contained. The pregnancy's intact." Katerina woke slowly, disoriented, in pain despite the morphine, but alive. Her hand moved to her belly, feeling for movement, finding it. The baby kicked against her palm. She looked at Mercer, said nothing, just held his gaze with an expression that communicated everything words couldn't. Mercer weighed her that evening. 103 pounds. She'd lost weight during the infection and surgery, but she was alive. The baby was alive. The numbers would climb again. On August 6, 1945, the radio in the barracks announced news that changed everything. An atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima, Japan, a weapon unlike anything in human history, a single bomb that destroyed an entire city, killed perhaps 100,000 civilians, vaporized people, left shadows burned into concrete where human beings had stood. The POWs gathered around the radio, listening to descriptions of destruction so complete it defied comprehension. A mushroom cloud rising 8 miles into the sky, fires visible from 50 miles away, blast wave that flattened buildings 3 miles from ground zero. The radio mentioned estimates, casualties, civilian deaths. The numbers kept climbing as reports came in. Elizabeth Schneider stood near the radio, one hand on her belly, now visibly pregnant at 82 pounds. Her face had gone pale. "They told us Americans were monsters," she said quietly. Everyone in the barracks could hear her. "They said you bayonet prisoners, spit on wounded, no honor, no mercy, no humanity." She looked around, at the medical equipment, at the food supplies, at Mercer and Callahan and the civilian doctors who'd risked everything to save them. "They fed us bacon," she continued, voice breaking. "They gave us medicine. They fought their own commanders to keep us alive. And they dropped the sun on 100,000 civilians." Anna Weber spoke up from her cot. "Everything was a lie. The propaganda about Americans was a lie. But we believed it. We worked for the Reich because we thought we were fighting monsters." Maria Hoffman, pregnant, recovering, added, "And now we know the monsters wore our uniforms, spoke our language, told us we were defending civilization while they built camps and started wars and destroyed everything good." The barracks went quiet. The radio continued its broadcast. More numbers, more destruction. President Truman's statement about forcing Japanese surrender. Military necessity. Saving American lives. Mercer turned off the radio. The silence that followed was profound. "You're not monsters," Katerina said, looking at Mercer. "You proved that. Every day, every treatment, every rule you broke to save us. You proved that humanity survives even war." That night, Elizabeth went into labor. August 6, 1945, 2100 hours. Elizabeth Schneider's water broke 2 hours after the Hiroshima broadcast ended. She was sitting on her cot, still processing the news of 100,000 civilians vaporized in an instant when the cramping started. Sharp, insistent, her body making demands that couldn't be delayed. She called out in German. Dorothy Callahan was there in seconds. "Captain Mercer!" Callahan shouted across the barracks. "It's time!" Elizabeth had gained 14 pounds since that first bacon breakfast. 82 pounds now. Still dangerously underweight for childbirth, still high risk in every measurable way, but alive, conscious, strong enough to attempt what her body had been preparing for despite impossible odds. Dr. Beatrice Whitmore arrived within 30 minutes, driving from Austin at speeds that would have earned a citation if any patrol car had been foolish enough to pull over a woman clearly racing toward an emergency. She came through the barracks door carrying her medical bag, hair-disheveled eyes sharp with professional focus. "How far apart are the contractions?" Whitmore asked, already moving toward Elizabeth's section. 5 minutes, Callahan reported. "Blood pressure elevated but stable, fetal heart rate strong." Whitmore examined Elizabeth quickly, efficiently. Her face revealed nothing, but Mercer had worked with her long enough to read the micro-expressions. The slight tightening around her eyes. The way her hands moved fractionally slower during palpation. She pulled Mercer aside. "The baby's position is good. Elizabeth's cervix is dilating normally, but her pelvis is narrow, made worse by malnutrition. The bones didn't develop properly during adolescence. There's a real chance the baby won't fit through the birth canal. Caesarean. If we have to. But I'd like to try vaginal delivery first. C-section on a woman this malnourished carries its own massive risks. Let's see what her body can do." They set up the makeshift delivery area. Clean sheets, sterilized instruments, blankets warmed by hot water bottles because the Texas night had turned cool and newborns needed heat. Everything ready for whatever came next. Elizabeth labored through the night, contractions coming harder, faster, closer together. She gripped the bed frame until her knuckles went white. Sweat soaked through her hospital gown despite the cool air. She spoke in German, fragments of prayers and curses, and her mother's name calling out to someone thousands of miles away who couldn't hear, couldn't help, couldn't do anything but survive in the ruins of Hamburg and hope her daughter lived through this. At 0300 hours, Whitmore checked dilation again. 8 centimeters. Close. Not close enough. At 0345, Elizabeth started screaming. Not the controlled breathing they'd taught her. Pure agony as contractions peaked beyond what her body could manage. Whitmore's expression changed. "We're not making progress. Baby's head is engaging but not descending. The pelvis is too narrow." "Caesarean?" Mercer asked. "We have to." They moved fast. No time for proper setup. No time for anything except speed and skill and hoping that improvised field surgery in a converted barracks would be enough. Whitmore prepped while Mercer administered anesthesia, just enough to dull the worst pain, not enough to compromise breathing. Elizabeth's eyes were wide, terrified, searching Mercer's face for reassurance he couldn't honestly give. "Am I dying?" she asked in German, the same question she'd asked 3 months ago when she weighed 68 pounds, and the world seemed determined to finish what the labor camp had started. "No," Mercer said firmly. "We're bringing your baby into the world. That's all." Whitmore cut. Fast, precise, experienced hands working with the confidence of someone who'd done this procedure hundreds of times. But never like this. Never in a barracks with insufficient light and sterilization protocols held together with hope and boiled water. The incision opened. Whitmore reached inside. "I have the head," she said. "Shoulders coming. Now." She lifted the baby free. A boy. 6 pounds even, which was impossibly good given everything. But he was blue, silent, limp in Whitmore's hands. The universe held its breath. Callahan was ready. She took the baby, laid him on a clean towel, suctioned his mouth and nose with practiced efficiency. Clear airways, stimulate breathing. The protocols were automatic, drilled into muscle memory through years of training. Nothing. The baby stayed blue. Stay silent. Callahan worked faster, rubbing his back, clearing more fluid, providing gentle ventilation with a squeeze bag. Still nothing. Mercer looked at Elizabeth. She was conscious enough to see, to understand. Her eyes tracked to the blue baby, to Callahan's increasingly desperate efforts, to the reality that after everything, after gaining 14 pounds and surviving tuberculosis and making it through pregnancy against impossible odds, her son wasn't breathing. "Come on," Callahan whispered. "Come on, Thomas. Breathe." She'd named him already. Thomas. After Mercer's father, who'd died in a wagon. After the promise that death wouldn't win. Callahan squeezed the ventilation bag again. Once. Twice. On the third squeeze, the baby's chest moved on its own. A gasp. Thin. Weak. But a breath. Then another. Then a cry. Reedy and angry and absolutely perfect. The blue faded. Pink spread across his skin like dawn. His hands uncurled. His legs kicked. He was alive and breathing and furious about being born into a world of bright lights and cold air and strange hands. Callahan wrapped him in warm blankets, brought him to Elizabeth, placed him on her chest where he could hear her heartbeat, smell her skin, know that he was safe, even though nothing in his short existence should have taught him that safety existed. Elizabeth stared at her son. Her hands trembled as they touched his face, counted his fingers, verified that he was real. 8 weeks ago I weighed 68 pounds, she whispered in German. Tonight I delivered a 6-pound baby. How? Mercer knelt beside the bed. Because you ate bacon. Because you chose to fight. Because you decided to live. Elizabeth looked at him, tears streaming down her face. You risked everything for us. Your career, your reputation. You broke every rule. For people who worked for the enemy. Why? Mercer thought about his father, about that wagon ride, about the promise he'd made at 14 years old. Because weight doesn't lie, he said quietly. You were 68 pounds. That was truth. And I'm a doctor. When I see truth like that, I have only one job. Make the numbers change. Thomas made a small sound against Elizabeth's chest. Not quite a cry. Just baby noises exploring his new voice. He's perfect, Elizabeth said. He's a fighter, Whitmore added, finishing the suturing. 6 pounds, despite everything. Strong heartbeat, good colour. He wanted to live. Over the next 3 weeks, 2 more babies arrived. Maria Hoffman delivered on August 10th. A girl, 5.5 pounds. Born during a thunderstorm that shook the barracks and turned the compound into red mud. Maria had gained 11 pounds since the pot roast breakthrough, still underweight, still high risk. But her body managed. The baby came naturally quickly with fewer complications than anyone expected. They named her Sarah. She had dark hair, and her mother's determination nursing strongly from the first attempt. Katerina Brown delivered on August 29th, a boy, 5 pounds. The smallest of the 3, but fierce. He came 3 weeks early, probably triggered by the surgical stress his mother's body had endured. But he breathed on his own, cried on his own, latched and fed and proved that sometimes 5 pounds of stubbornness mattered more than size. They named him Michael. 3 mothers, 3 babies, all alive. The weight records told the story in numbers that couldn't be denied. Elizabeth Schneider, 68 pounds to 102 pounds. 34-pound gain in 14 weeks. Maria Hoffman, 66 pounds to 94 pounds, 28 pounds. Katerina Braun fluctuated due to infection and surgery but stabilized at 98 pounds post-delivery. Average weight gain across all 40 women, 26 pounds. Tuberculosis patients, 12 treated, 12 recovered. Fractures, 8 healed, though some left permanent deformities. Infections resolved. Mortality 0. Mercer kept meticulous records, documented every treatment, every outcome, every supply requisition and its justification. He knew the investigation was coming, knew that Major Theodore Prescott had filed formal complaints with the Inspector General's office, knew that using military resources to save enemy prisoners while American boys prepared for the invasion of Japan would draw scrutiny that no amount of humanitarian reasoning could fully deflect. But the numbers didn't lie, and numbers were the only defense that mattered. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. all of it, Europe and Pacific. 4 years of global violence grinding to a stop. The camp erupted in celebration, radios blared, soldiers cheered, someone fired shots into the air in pure exuberance. The mess hall broke out whatever alcohol could be found or improvised. The future suddenly existed again. Going home became possible instead of theoretical. In the medical barracks, the 40 German women listened to the broadcast in silence. The war that had consumed their lives, destroyed their country, killed their loved ones, and scattered them across the ocean to a prisoner camp in Texas, was finally over. But what came next? Germany was rubble. Cities destroyed, government collapsed, economy shattered, families displaced or dead. Going home meant returning to devastation with no guarantee of finding anyone or anything recognizable. Elizabeth sat with Thomas, sleeping in her arms.
"What happens to us now?" she asked Mercer. "Repatriation eventually. The army will process you, send you back to Germany when transportation is arranged."
And then?
Mercer had no answer. The honest truth was, he didn't know. Nobody knew. The machinery of rebuilding a broken world had barely started turning. It would be months, maybe years, before anything resembling normal emerged from the ruins. "Then you survive," he said finally. "You find your mother. You show her Thomas. You rebuild. With what? We have nothing. You have your life. You have your son. That's more than millions can say." Elizabeth looked at the baby. "Because of you. Because one American doctor decided we deserved to live. Because the scale read 68 pounds and I couldn't walk away from that." On August 20th, a staff car arrived at Camp Swift. 2 lieutenant colonels from the Inspector General's office. Serious men with briefcases and expressions that revealed nothing.
They set up in Colonel Hartfield's office, requested all medical records for the German POW facility, requested supply requisitions, requested testimony from Captain Nathaniel Mercer, Lieutenant Dorothy Callahan, and Major Theodore Prescott. The investigation took 4 days. Mercer testified on August 21st, answered questions about his decision to exceed standard POW medical protocols, about supply diversions, about unauthorized civilian medical personnel, about the use of expensive medications like streptomycin on enemy prisoners. He brought his weight records, showed the progression, 68 pounds to 102, explained what those numbers meant, what they required, what would have happened without intervention. "Captain Mercer," one of the lieutenant colonels asked, "are you aware that the resources you expended on these prisoners could have treated American servicemen?" "Yes, sir." "And you proceeded anyway?" "Yes, sir." Why? Mercer thought about how to answer. He could cite Geneva Convention requirements for adequate medical care, could argue that adequate was subjective and his interpretation was defensible, could hide behind regulations and interpretations and technical justifications. Instead, he said, "Because I'm a doctor. When I see someone dying and I have the means to save them, I act. Nationality doesn't change that obligation. Even when those people worked for an enemy regime, they were seamstresses and teachers and factory workers, not soldiers, not war criminals, just people caught in a machine they didn't build and couldn't stop. And when they arrived here, they were dying. The scale doesn't care about politics. 68 pounds is 68 pounds. The lieutenant colonel made notes. His expression gave nothing away. Prescott testified on August 22nd. He was precise, clinical, devastating, listed every regulation Mercer had violated, every supply diverted, every procedure conducted without proper authorization. He framed it as theft, misappropriation of military resources, prioritization of enemy welfare over American interests. These women, Prescott said, made bandages and uniforms for soldiers who killed Americans. They supported the Reich's war effort, providing them with exceptional medical care while American boys waited for basic treatment is not just poor judgment, it's betrayal. Callahan testified on August the 23rd. She brought photographs, before and after, 40 women on arrival skeletal and hollow-eyed, 40 women now healthy enough to walk to work to care for their babies. "Major Prescott is correct," she said. "Captain Mercer violated protocols,
but those protocols would have killed these women. Sometimes following rules means watching people die when you could save them. Captain Mercer chose to save them. I'd make the same choice. The lieutenant colonels asked about the 3 babies.
All healthy, Callahan reported. Thomas, 6 pounds, Sarah, 5.5, Michael, 5. All nursing well, all developing normally. 3 lives that wouldn't exist if we'd followed standard POW medical protocols. On August the 24th, Colonel Hartfield testified. He walked into the office with a folder thick with correspondence. "Gentlemen," he said, sitting down without waiting for permission, "let me save us all some time. I authorized Captain Mercer's actions. Every supply requisition, every treatment decision, every expenditure of resources. The responsibility is mine." One of the lieutenant colonels looked up sharply. "Colonel, are you aware that such authorization exceeds your command authority?" "I'm aware that I'm the base commander and these women were dying in my custody. I'm aware that dead prisoners are bad optics. I'm aware that Captain Mercer's interventions prevented a humanitarian disaster that would have made headlines and embarrassed the army. Yes, we spent resources. Yes, we bent rules. And the result is 40 living women and 3 healthy babies instead of mass casualties and an international incident. Colonel, with respect, the regulations exist for reasons." Hartfield opened his folder. "I've been documenting similar cases from other POW camps. Camp Huntsville in Alabama, Camp Trinidad in Colorado, Camp Ruston in Louisiana. Want to know what happened when they followed standard protocols for severely malnourished prisoners? Mortality rates between 20 and 40%, deaths from tuberculosis, deaths from refeeding syndrome, deaths that generated press coverage, congressional inquiries and accusations of war crimes." He slid papers across the desk. "Camp Swift has 0 deaths. 0. That's the outcome that matters." The lieutenant colonels exchanged glances, made notes, asked more questions. The investigation concluded on August 25th. The verdict came through official channels on September 1st. Finding Captain Nathaniel Mercer violated multiple military regulations regarding supply requisition, medical protocols and resource allocation. Colonel Warren Hartfield exceeded his command authority in authorizing said violations. Lieutenant Dorothy Callahan participated in unauthorized medical procedures. However, given the extraordinary circumstances, the humanitarian concerns, the successful outcomes, and the potential for international incident, had mortality occurred, the violations are determined to warrant official reprimand rather than court-martial. Consequence: Captain Mercer would receive an official reprimand in his permanent record. Promotion potential capped. He would not advance beyond his current rank. Colonel Hartfield would be permitted to retire with honor rather than face forced removal. Retirement effective October 1945. Lieutenant Callahan would receive a written warning but no permanent record notation. Mercer read the verdict in his office. The scale sat on his desk, brass weights gleaming. He thought about his father, about that promise made at 14, about whether he'd kept it or broken it in some fundamental way. He'd saved 40 lives. 3 babies existed who shouldn't have. But his career was over, his reputation damaged, and somewhere American soldiers who might have benefited from the resources he'd diverted would never know what they'd lost. The math was brutal in ways the scale couldn't measure. Repatriation began in October 1945. The 40 women were processed, documented, assigned to transport ships heading back to Europe, back to a Germany that existed only in ruins and memory, back to uncertainty and devastation and the hard work of rebuilding from nothing. Elizabeth found Mercer the day before departure. Thomas was 2 months old, healthy, gaining weight steadily. She carried him wrapped in blankets the camp had provided. "I don't know how to thank you," she said in careful English she'd been practicing. "You don't need to thank me. You risked everything. Your career is damaged because of us." Mercer looked at Thomas. The baby was awake, dark eyes tracking movement, already showing personality, the fierce will to live that had pulled him through a birth that should have killed him. "My career isn't damaged," Mercer said quietly. "It's exactly where it should be. I became a doctor to save lives.
I did that. The rest is just bureaucracy. Elizabeth shifted Thomas to one arm, reached out and took Mercer's hand. I will tell him about you. Every day. He will know the name Nathaniel Mercer. He will know what you did. Just help him be kind. That's all I ask. The women left on October 28th. 40 women in grey dresses boarding trucks that would take them to a port, to a ship, to an ocean crossing, to a homeland that barely existed anymore. Mercer stood with Callahan and watched them go.
The compound felt empty after, quiet in ways that had nothing to do with sound. Was it worth it? Callahan asked. Everything we risked, everything we lost. Mercer thought about Elizabeth at 68 pounds asking if she was dying, about Thomas born blue and silent, about 40 women who'd believed Americans were monsters learning otherwise. Every day, he replied, and every day the answer is yes. The letters started arriving in 1946. Elizabeth first, a photograph of Thomas at 6 months, learning to sit up, round-faced and healthy. She'd found her mother in Hamburg, both alive, both rebuilding. Maria second, Sarah's first birthday. The little girl smiling at the camera, dark hair in pigtails. Maria had gotten a teaching position, was helping educate children in the ruins. Katerina third. Michael at 18 months, already walking. Katerina had immigrated to Canada, started over. Her letter mentioned that Michael asked questions constantly, showed the same stubborn determination that had kept him alive when he was 5 pounds and born too early. The letters continued. 1952, 1958, 1965. Thomas graduated medical school, became a cardiac surgeon in Boston. Elizabeth wrote that he'd chosen medicine because of the story she'd told him every year on his birthday, about the American doctor who'd saved his mother when she weighed 68 pounds, who'd delivered him when every number said it was impossible. Sarah became a teacher like her mother, taught for 40 years in Hamburg, educated thousands of students. Maria wrote that every lesson about kindness, about choosing compassion over hate, came from what she'd learned in a Texas barracks in 1945. Michael became an engineer, built things, fixed things, married and had children who would never know war, never know starvation, never know anything except the peace their grandfather's generation had bled to create. Mercer kept every letter in a shoebox, stored it next to his medical bag from the war, rarely looked at them. Didn't need to. The words were memorized. He left the army in 1950, returned to Oklahoma, opened a rural practice in the same town where he'd worked before the war, treated farmers and ranchers, delivered babies, set bones, fought the small disasters of country life. He never spoke publicly about Camp Swift. When asked about his military service, he'd say he'd been a doctor in Europe and Texas. Medical corps. Nothing remarkable. The people who knew him understood that meant he didn't want to talk about it. They respected that silence. His office had one photograph on the wall, 40 women in Texas sun, 3 infants in their arms, Mercer and Callahan in white coats standing to the side. Taken the day before repatriation. Underneath a small brass plaque, Camp Swift 1945, the ones who lived. The scale stayed on his desk. He used it occasionally. Weighed babies at checkups, monitored patients' progress. The brass weights had been calibrated properly in 1946. The bloodstains were still visible on the platform. He never tried to clean them off. Sometimes patients asked about the old scale. Why use it when modern spring scales were faster, easier? Because, Mercer would say, weight doesn't lie. This scale proved that once. I keep it to remember. He didn't explain further. Didn't need to. Callahan wrote occasionally. She'd become head nurse at a Boston hospital, never married. Dedicated her life to medicine. Her letters were efficient, clinical, exactly like her personality. In 1982 she wrote, "Do you ever wonder if we did the right thing, saving them while American boys died? I think about it sometimes. Then I remember Thomas and Sarah and Michael. 3 lives, 7 grandchildren now. The math keeps expanding." Mercer wrote back, "The math has always been simple. 40 lives saved, everything else is noise." On March 12, 1983, Nathaniel Mercer died in his sleep. Heart failure, 74 years old.
A long life by any measure. A full life. The obituary in the local paper ran 2 paragraphs, mentioned his service in World War II, his decades as a country doctor, his dedication to his community. Nothing about Camp Swift, nothing about 40 women or 3 babies or regulations violated, just beloved physician, decorated veteran, will be greatly missed. The funeral was scheduled for March 15th at the small Baptist church where Mercer had attended services when he bothered to attend at all. The family expected 50 people, maybe 75. Small-town turnout for a quiet man who'd lived a quiet life. On March 15th, the church parking lot filled before 9 in the morning. Then the street filled. Then people started parking 3 blocks away and walking. By 10 o'clock, when the service was scheduled to start, 200 people crowded the church and spilled onto the lawn. At 10:15, a car pulled up. Rental plates. 3 elderly women emerged. European clothes. Unfamiliar faces. Elizabeth Schneider, 62 years old now. Grey hair, but still those same blue eyes. Maria Hoffman, 59 years old. Face lined but strong. Katharina Braun, 64, leaning slightly on a cane but steady. Behind them, 3 adults in their late 30s. Thomas, 37, Sarah, 37, Michael, 37. Behind them, 7 teenagers and young adults, the grandchildren. They walked into the church. The crowd parted. Whispered questions rippled through. Who were these people? Why had they flown from Europe for a small-town doctor's funeral? Elizabeth approached the casket. She carried a bouquet, 40 white roses. She laid them gently on the closed lid. Then she turned to face the congregation. My name is Elizabeth Mercer, was not my father, was not my family, was not even my countrymen. Her English was accented but clear. In 1945, I weighed 68 pounds. I was pregnant, dying in an American prison camp. Dr. Mercer risked his career to save me, broke every rule, fought his commanders, spent resources he wasn't authorized to spend. She gestured to Thomas. This is my son. He exists because Dr. Mercer decided that rules mattered less than lives. Maria stepped forward. I am Maria Hoffman. Dr. Mercer saved me. This is my daughter, Sarah. She taught school for 40 years, educated thousands of children, because one American doctor chose compassion over regulations. Katharina spoke last. Tarina spoke. I am Katharina Braun. This is my son, Michael. He has 3 children. They will never know the hunger and fear I knew, because Dr. Mercer proved that humanity survives even war. The 3 women stood together, elderly now, survivors, living proof of decisions made 38 years ago in a Texas barracks. Elizabeth spoke again. We brought 40 white roses, 1 for each life he saved. We came from Germany and Canada to stand here because the world needs to know, needs to remember, that one person's courage can ripple across generations, across continents, across decades. The congregation was silent, the kind of silence that held weight. That changed understanding. Dorothy Callahan stood from her pew. She was 68 now, retired, but she walked to the front with the same efficient purpose she'd carried through the war. Nathaniel Mercer asked me once if saving those women was worth the cost, she said. Her voice was steady, clinical, precisely calibrated. I'll answer now publicly so everyone understands. 40 women lived, 3 babies were born. Thomas became a cardiac surgeon in Boston. Sarah became a teacher in Hamburg, educating thousands. Michael became an engineer in Toronto. Together they've raised 7 children who carry forward the gift he gave. She looked at the casket. The math doesn't lie. One man's courage equals ripples across 3 generations, 2 continents, 40 years. History won't record Camp Swift, but we do, and that's enough. The service continued. Hymns were sung. The pastor spoke about service and dedication and living a life that mattered, but everyone present understood that the real eulogy had already been delivered by 3 elderly women and a nurse who'd stood beside a doctor when he broke every rule to do what was right. They buried Mercer in the town cemetery. Simple headstone, his name, his dates, his military rank, nothing else. But at the foot of the grave, Elizabeth placed the 40 white roses. They stood brilliant against the Oklahoma red dirt. Proof that some things couldn't be measured in regulations or protocols or official reprimands. Some things could only be measured in lives saved, in children born, in grandchildren who would carry forward the story of a doctor who looked at a scale reading 68 pounds and decided that truth demanded action. The scale went to the Texas Historical Society, donated by Mercer's estate with specific instructions. Display it. Tell the story. Make sure people understand. It sits now in a climate-controlled case. The brass waits beside it. A placard explaining its history. The bloodstains still visible on the platform. The needle resting at 0, waiting for the next truth to measure. The placard reads, "This scale belonged to Captain Nathaniel Mercer, Army Medical Corps, World War II. In May 1945, he used it to document the conditions of 40 German POWs at Camp Swift, Texas. The weights he recorded as low as 68 pounds for adult women led him to violate military regulations to provide life-saving care. All 40 women survived. 3 babies were born. This scale recorded proof that propaganda couldn't erase that weight like truth returns when fed with kindness. Captain Mercer received an official reprimand for his actions. He never regretted them. Every year on May 23rd, the anniversary of that first weighing, someone places white roses beside the display case. Sometimes it's Thomas or Sarah or Michael visiting from Boston or Hamburg or Toronto. Sometimes it's one of the grandchildren carrying forward the tradition. Sometimes it's strangers who've read the story, who understand what those numbers meant, what they required, what they proved. The roses are always white, always 40 of them. Always placed with care that suggests prayer or promise or both. And the scale sits silent in its case, brass, gleaming bloodstains visible, telling a story that textbooks forgot, but that matters more than most of what textbooks remember. That compassion, even in war's darkest hours, can tip the scales. That one person's choice to act when others look away can save not just lives, but futures. That sometimes the most important victories aren't measured in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in pounds regained, babies born, and roses placed on graves by people who exist because someone decided they deserved to live. 68 pounds to 102 pounds. The numbers didn't lie. They never do. And in the end, that truth was the only one that mattered.